Michael Eric Dyson once struggled as an 18-year-old father in his native city of Detroit. Today, he is an ordained Baptist minister who received his Ph.D. from Princeton. The prolific author, lecturer, and professor of communications at the University of North Carolina has a new book, Between God and Gangsta Rap, bearing witness to black culture. It is a collection of his essays that have appeared in many of our nation's top publications, from the New York Times to Vibe, and I am pleased to have him here. Welcome.
Thank you.
Anybody from North Carolina comes here, welcome to this broadcast.
I bring you greetings from UNC.
Well, they are all good friends, and I'm anxious to get back soon.
All right.
Tell me about first the title of this, Between God and Gangsta Rap. What's Between God and Gangsta Rap?
Well, I think the infinite variety of black cultural expression. On the one hand, you've got the sacred, and on the other hand, the secular, even though I don't believe in that sort of rigid division. But it does capture, I think, rather nicely in this metaphor how much black culture is shaped between secular and sacred forces, and how the interpenetration of those forces determines so much of our lives. And what I wanted to do is to bridge the gulf and gap between those who occupy the ancient traditions of the black church, the word, and the preoccupation with spirit.
That's God.
That's right, that's the God. And those who are dealing with the word in a much different way in the secular realm. The gangster rappers, the hip-hoppers, those who are in the secular vocation of bringing prophetic critique in American society and making it sing with vitality and vigor. And so I wanted to find a way to bridge those two worlds so that two kinds of traditions might have conversation with one another.
And how do you do that?
Well, you do it by writing about it, by thinking about it. In my case, you do it by trying to deal with the realities of the hip-hop as well as those of the ancient church and bring them into contact with one another, so that when I go to deal with hip-hoppers and I appear on programs with them and I show them that I can rap, and I'll put out a couple of raps and let them know, hey, I know what's going on, and then I invite them to interrogate my side of the divide. You know, what do you know about Du Bois? What do you figure out about the great African-American writers, and how does that literate tradition inform your oral preoccupations, and what do you understand about who came before you? So I want to establish a conversation.
But do you find among those rap artists a consciousness and a sense of tradition with a Ralph Ellison or with whoever it is that is part of that great tradition of black culture, whether it's jazz artists, whether it's literary artists, whether it is storytellers, or whether it is political figures, whether it is religious figures, Gardner Taylor and people like that?
That's right.
Where is the link, and where is their consciousness of that important onward march of a civilization?
Well, sometimes it's quite conscious. I mean, you run into some rappers who are surprisingly literate about those ancient traditions. And then there are some who are cut off from them. And that's one of the, I think, the great disservices of this division generationally between older and younger blacks. So what I try to do is to introduce them to some of that. They may have extended the tradition of signification. They may extend the tradition of playing orally with the kinds of words that they employ. So what I wanted them to make them know is what happened before them, and to introduce them to some jazz figures, to introduce them to some literate figures who they may have never heard of, and yet once they discover them, they read them, they take them seriously. And part of this shift from the literate to the cinematic culture, and part of the shift from literate back into the oral culture, is that there's been a divorce from those ancient traditions that served so powerfully the survival needs of ancient black peoples. And so what I'm trying to do is to force them to come to grips with that. But I also, Charlie, want to force this literate culture and this so-called religious culture to take these kids seriously. So that I say, when you hear a Biggie Smalls, back in the day, our parents used to take care of us. Look at them now. They're even blanking scared of us, calling the state for help because they can't maintain. Darn things done change. If I wasn't in the rap game, I'd probably have a key knee deep in the crack game, because the streets is a short stop. Either you're slinging crack rock or you got a wicked jump shot. I want to bring them into conversation with a Gardner Taylor, a Frederick George Sampson, a Jeremiah Wright, a Carolyn Knight, a Sue J. Johnson, and so on. And I want to see, what do they have in common? First, the preoccupation with verbal innovation and wizardry. Secondly, the appreciation for the use of the word in kind of changing the life circumstances of people. And thirdly, the sheer hedonistic pleasure, the joie de vivre that can be derived from engaging in something done excellently. Those kind of bridges, I think, can force those two traditions at least to be brought in closer proximity to one another.
What, looking at the broad notion of black culture in America in 1996 and thinking about the next 4 years, what forces are at work, positive and negative?
Well, I think on the positive side, this perennial search in African-American culture for new forms of cultural expression. I mean, hip-hop itself grew out of economic collapse of the last 15 years, and yet it has spawned one of the most tremendously expressive cultures that has been produced within African-American society. The second thing, I think, is the perennial quest for survival. how do black people make a way in the world that is fundamentally inimical and hostile to them? And how do they generate forms of sanity and psychic maturity and security that allow them to defend themselves against the onslaught? The negative forces, I think, continue to be moral and spiritual deprivation, moral and economic misery, and the ways in which those moral problems are in some senses created by the material deprivation. I don't want to establish a one-on-one link, because many people who are poor, most people who are poor, are very morally sensitive and capable. But the capabilities of some of those people who are poor will continue to be exacerbated. I think I enjoy a quote by Dorothy Day which says, "I want to work toward a world in which it's possible for people to behave decently." And what I see is one of the major problems, this new concept called moral poverty, the way in which the impoverishment of the moral imagination of peoples, especially in this case poor African Americans, has to be juxtaposed to the material and economic suffering that occur. Secondly, I think what's going on is the kind of the collapse of infrastructures of meaning and survival for so many people, not just African Americans, but in this case, many poor black African Americans. I don't mean the collapse of their own moral sensibilities. I mean the collapse of a society that concerned about them, that cares about them, and that gives a hoot about who and what they are. When we see the poster girls and poster boys of welfare being young black people and black mothers, when we see the kind of Newt Gingrichization of American political discourse where there's a scapegoating of so many who are poor and the least of these and those who are locked out of the economic security of American society, I think that black people will continue to bear a disproportionate brunt of that. And thirdly, I think what's going on is this real crisis of class in African American culture. I think the incredible divides between the have-gots and the have-nots, between the middle-class bourgeois blacks and those who are so-called in the underclass will continue to be
exacerbated. What is it that you
exacerbated.
want those have-gots to do for the have-nots that they haven't done?
Well, first of all, is to acknowledge that they're part and parcel, woof and warp of the same tradition and moral fabric. That is, many people argue that when black people move out to the suburbs and exurbs, they leave behind these morally decrepit people who have no imagination about ethical practices in life. That's hogwash. What I want them to do is to be conscious, number one, that they are part and parcel of what they are. It's not them people. It's not those folk over there in the ghetto. That's us. And I'm particularly sensitive to this because I was part of that demonized, nihilistic, pathological remnant that was seen to be not much worth in American culture.
How did you rise out of that?
Well, I rose out of it first because I had a tremendously important figure in my life, Dr. Frederick George Sampson, who was my pastor. A Shakespearean figure, if there ever was one. He would come into the pulpit, talk about Bertrand Russell and W.E.B. Du Bois and Shakespeare, and move into the vernacular traditions of African-American culture. I admired and emulated that.
But now what does that say there? I mean, there is something basic about that.
Right.
Somebody put his hand on your shoulder and said,
right.
You matter.
That's right.
You can be whatever
That's right.
you want to be.
That's right. Well, that's important. I mean, in this each one, teach one, each one, reach one, may sound like some sappy liberal, pep, but it's very important because when a person reaches out and says, you are significant, you mean something, you got a good mind, that does something.
But that's a basic value. That's not liberal or conservative. It just has to do with basic fundamental value, does it not? That
I
all
agree
of us
with that.
somehow need to think that we matter and that somebody cares.
Sure. I mean, we need to be intimately acquainted with excellence, and we need to see it reflected in a person that we have access to. Part of what the role model movement is about is seeing somebody that looks like you, of seeing somebody who has the capacity to engage in excellent exhortation and in the intellectual investigation of the life of the mind in extraordinary ways. And I saw that. I saw it up close. I saw it in my fifth grade teacher, Mrs. James, who taught us about black history. But you see, I came up where I was appreciating both the so-called great books of American society, where we could talk about Tennyson, though much is taken, much abides. And though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are along with. I've got sunshine on a cloudy day. When it's cold outside, I got the month of May. I guess you say, what can make me feel that way? My girl. I believe that Motown and Shakespeare, Motown and great history, the vernacular traditions of African-American culture, and Richard Dana's 2 Years Before the Mass were integral to creating and crafting a vision of the world that would sustain me as a particular person of color in late 20th century American society.
Do you believe the divide between white and black in America is growing?
In some instances it is growing, or should I say the fault line is being revealed in more explicit ways. The O.J. Simpson case really ripped off any facade that we believed about the ways in which white and black Americans were intimately embracing one another across that divide. Unfortunately, I was on a radio program and a woman called up and said, listen, I've lost my faith in God as a result of O.J. This made me question myself. I want to take back all the stuff we gave you people, affirmative action and so on. Well, O.J. didn't create that perception, but what O.J. did was rip off the facade that kept it at bay. On the other hand, I think many African Americans have to be challenged about their uncritical valorization of O.J. simply because he's black. The kind of race think and race loyalty and race rationality that prevails in so many African American communities has to be somehow shattered. And so I think in some instances, black and white Americans are, on the other hand, coming together because we're forced to deal with the problems of American culture that we have in common: crime, economic misery, moral desperation. These unite us in an attempt somehow to defend ourselves as Americans against the kind of civic terror that holds at bay the very principles we want to see flourish. So what we have to do is come together across that divide.
Yeah, two phenomena that happened in the last 12 months. One is the Million Man March on Washington. You were there.
Yes.
Yeah. What did it mean for you?
Well, it was something that was almost unspeakable. I heard the criticisms both from feminist friends and others who were critics, and I took them seriously and thought about them and pondered them even since coming back from the Million Man March. But what it meant for me going there was that this was a broad affirmation of the fundamental humanity of African American men. I mean, when I sat there and looked out upon that veritable ocean of black masculinity, not being demonized or scapegoat, but just loving and affirming one another.
And being asked to take responsibility for their lives and their children.
Which is nothing new, of course. I mean, that responsibility was new in the sense that Louis Farrakhan was sounding that note in ways that other Americans hadn't before heard him. But he's made a living, as well as the Nation of Islam, in dealing with the problems, plight, and predicament of African-American men, especially those who are poor and those who are in prison. But it is a sense of taking responsibility, of reaffirming, not affirming for the first time, reaffirming the need to somehow embrace one another and be responsible to our children and our families.
What about Waiting to Exhale?
Well, that's, I thought it was a fun film, and I thought I derived a great deal of joy by seeing black women represented not as bitches and hoes and skeezers and sluts, not as some women who were appendages to men, but women who were flawed but attempting to somehow to reconstitute their lives away from the need to so desperately cling on to black men. And, you know, black men who claim that this is somehow bashing black men really are misled and wrong-headed. Because
it's more of an affirmation than it is a rejection.
Of course it is. It's an affirmation that black women need to see themselves in ways that are positive, loving, and affirming. And I think that's nothing wrong with that.
When you look at heroes for you, who do you count high? I mean, is Gardner Taylor a hero because of the powerful message he brings from the pulpit?
Yes, he is. He's an extraordinary figure, and this is what the piece in my book is in homage to him. An extraordinary rhetorician, an eloquent spokesman for the needs and claims of African American Christianity, but more importantly, for the broader claims of our common humanity as Christians trying to struggle in the real world against forces of racism, against forces of economic oppression, but also trying to become morally mature. People like him and my pastor, Dr. Frederick George Sampson, are quite important to me because they represent the most powerful expression of African American culture. And my fifth grade teacher, Mrs. James, who taught me the simple pleasure of loving black people and affirming one another as human beings.
The conflict that exists in Washington, and Colin Powell. What would his candidacy have meant to black America?
Yeah, well, a whole lot. I think Colin Powell is an extraordinary figure whose uncandidacy, as it were, illumined the very submerged principles of race in American culture. On the one hand, we want to transcend race. We want to get beyond it. On the other hand, we're stuck in the rut. And I think that what Colin Powell's candidacy would have meant is that we were forced for the first time to seriously examine the limits of liberal and conservative discourse about getting beyond racism and yet being challenged by seeing the principles we cherish in black flesh. And Colin Powell would have forced many of us, even those of us who are on the left, to take seriously his own claim that we have to come together as black and white, not denying our African-American identity, and yet moving beyond it in order to embrace our common American identity. That's something that's very important.
You opened this book with a letter to your brother. Tell me about it.
Well, my brother's serving life in prison for second-degree murder. We believe he's innocent, his family, and yet he was charged 6 years ago with killing a young man. There was a dying declaration, which meant when the man was dying, he was asked, who did this to you? My brother's name was mentioned, something sounding close enough like that. And it's been a living hell in one sense for my family, because we've had to deal with the prison predicament and situation. My family, my mother and father reared us to be morally upright people whose deportment was exacting, and it reflected the Baptist church in which we were reared. They loved us and taught us to be respectable people, and this represents everything that contradicts that. And I've had many discussions with my brother, talking to him. We've been able to express our love for one another in ways that we didn't express before he went to prison, because my father believed we ought to be tough and we ought to be powerful machismo men, especially macho men in Detroit, where there was enormous violence, and especially directed toward black men by other black men. So we were taught to be tough and to be, in some senses, brutal in the sense that we could take care of ourselves. And I think that the lessons that we learned helped us survive. But my brother went one path, I went another, not because I'm morally superior to him, but because I think my talent was identified early. I think luck allows talent to shine. I was identified early on as a gifted young person. My brother wasn't, and that has made the difference in the ways in which our lives have turned out, at least partly.
Because it gave you opportunities he didn't have, or because it helped to create or nourish self-esteem in your
I think both
experience.
of those. I think both of those, both opportunity and nourishment.
You hear talk about the need for the NAACP not to be moderate, but to be back in terms on the firing line.
Yes.
Can we see Mfuma can do that, you think?
I think so, especially behind the scenes, because, you know, there's always a juxtaposition between charismatic leadership in the front and kind of systematic organization behind the scenes. I think he brings a bit of both. An enormously sophisticated and highly intelligent, gifted leader who I think will help reconstitute that organization along with Ms. Evers-Williams and along with Wade Henderson, moving it in the right direction, because it's very needed at this time in our own African-American history.
Manning Marable, who is professor of history and director of African-American studies at Columbia University, says this: among the young black intellectuals to emerge since the demise of the civil rights movement and the rise of white conservative, undoubtedly the most insightful and thought-provoking is Michael Eric Dyson. The book is Between God and Gangsta Rap, Bearing Witness to Black Culture. My thanks.
Thank you very kindly.
We'll be right back. Sam Neill is here. Stay with us.